G'day everyone, and welcome to the ninth Agony Anth, my collaboration with the Charles Darwin University Law Student Society. Today I've been asked, can you explain what parole is all about? And this is a fantastic question because parole is probably one of the most misunderstood concepts in our system of criminal law. And instinctively, it's easy to understand why. It's easy to understand why people say if they're sentenced to 5 years, they should do 5 years, otherwise, they're getting off too easy. And of course, it all becomes a lot worse when some idiot on parole goes and commits further offences. It makes sense that people will say, if he was in prison where he belonged, this wouldn't have happened. Well, I'm a supporter of the parole system, so I'm going to try and explain it and hopefully bring people around. First, you have to understand that just locking people up doesn't turn them into better people, and it generally doesn't stop other people from committing offences. People who commit offences generally either don't believe they're going to be caught, or they're so desperate or affected by substances or mentally unwell that they're not rationally thinking about the consequences of their offending. The United States locks up more people than any other developed country, and yet hardly say the United States is crime-free. The real question is what happens while the person is in prison and what happens once they're released. In our system of law, there are two types of parole, court-ordered parole and parole granted by the parole board. We're going to start by focusing on board parole. Queensland has an institution called the Parole Board. Most jurisdictions do. Prisoners who've served 50% of their sentence, or 15 years in the case of a life sentence, or up to 30 years for the most serious offences, prisoners who've served that time can apply for parole, and the parole board will consider whether to grant parole. The thing is, the parole process actually starts from the moment a prisoner is sentenced. When a prisoner is sentenced, the corrective services staff managing that prisoner will establish for the prisoner a parole pathway. This might involve the prisoner participating in certain education activities while in prison, for instance, if their basic literacy is poor. It might involve the prisoner undertaking programs directed towards their specific offending. So prisoners whose offending is linked to substance abuse will be offered programs to deal with addiction. Prisoners might be offered programs relating to anger management or respectful relationships. There are a bunch of these programs. And prisoners do these programs because they know the programs are part of their parole pathway. If there was no parole, there would be less reason for them to participate. A parole pathway will also include prisoners engaging in vocational education and participating in prison industries. Forget what you've seen on movies about prisoners making licence plates. The idea of prison industries is to build vocational skills for prisoners. Many people end up in prison because their upbringing has been so disordered that they haven't even had the opportunity to build the most fundamental skills. Reliability, for instance, the idea that work starts at 7, so you have to be there at 7. When prisoners are doing well in their sentences, they might be moved to a residential wing or a low security prison where they have much more responsibility for things like cooking for themselves. For some prisoners, these may genuinely be new life skills. The idea of all these programs is to reduce the factors that make a prisoner more likely to reoffend. And all of these programs rely on the possibility of parole as a motivator. A prisoner with no prospect of parole might as well say, get stuffed. I'm just going to kick back in my cell and play cards with the other guys in the wing for the next 5 years. That person gets out later, sure, but when they do get out, they're much more likely to commit further offences. How does that make the community any safer? So, our prisoner does half his sentence and comes up for parole. Parole's not automatic at that point. The parole board will look at the prisoner, their original offending, the sentencing remarks made by the judge who sentenced them, and then more importantly, the parole board will look at how the prisoner has gone in prison, whether they've committed further offences in prison, whether they've spent time in the discipline unit, whether they've completed their parole pathway, what their work history in prison has been like. And on the basis of all of this, the parole board can either knock them back and send them back to prison for a while longer, or the board can grant parole but then attach conditions. You see, a person on parole has not been set free. They're still serving their sentence, but they're serving it in the community. Parole conditions can be really varied. They can include a requirement to report to parole officers or police on a regular basis. The parolee will have to live at a designated address. They usually can't travel more than a certain distance from their home. They can be forbidden from associating with particular people or going to particular places. They can have a curfew placed on them. They can be tested basically without notice for drugs and alcohol. What this means is that a person on parole is not in prison, but they're definitely not free. They're still living a highly regulated life. Parole conditions are not all about regulating the prisoner either. Parolees can be required to continue participating in programs or counselling once they leave prison. They'll certainly be linked up with a post-release prisoner support service, and they'll be linked up with an organisation like, say, Mission Australia, which assists former prisoners to find employment. Because we know that one of the biggest indicators for a prisoner to avoid reoffending is achieving a level of financial stability. Underlying all of this, the parolee knows that if they are not home after curfew when the police come and check, or if they hand in a urine test with drug metabolites in it, or if they commit any further offences, they're going to be back in prison. All of this means that while the prisoner gets out of jail earlier, the community is safer in terms of the likelihood of any future offending. Now let's imagine what would happen if we really did force prisoners to serve their entire sentence. Our prisoner's sentenced to 5 years. He goes into prison and knows that regardless of how well he behaves or how badly he behaves, he's walking out of there in 5 years. This is true regardless of whether he participates in programs, regardless of whether he participates in prison industries, and regardless of how much time he spends in the discipline unit for disciplinary infractions. He gets to the end of his 5 years and he walks out the main gate. He's now a free man. No post-release programs, no restrictions on his movement, no drug and alcohol tests, no curfew, no connections with employment programs. He literally gets dropped off at the bus stop at full liberty. I don't see how anyone could think that that would put society in a better position long term. I mean, sure, we've segregated that person from society for 5 years, but we've almost locked in the fact that they're going to commit more offences when they come out. If what we want at the end of the day is released prisoners who don't commit more offences, then parole is the answer. Next, we need to consider court-ordered parole. This is where the court doesn't just set a parole eligibility date, the court actually sets a date when the prisoner must be released on parole. Obviously, this is a bit more favourable to the prisoner because it removes the whole parole board aspect of the process. Aha, some people will say, in that case, why does the prisoner need to do anything in prison? Why would they participate in programs if their parole date is locked in? We'll look at it this way. First and foremost, two of the sentencing options open to a judge are a suspended sentence and probation. So really, if a judge sentences an offender to 5 years in prison with a parole date after 3 years, the judge is really saying, in my view, an appropriate sentence is 3 years of prison followed by 2 years of parole. So it's not that the prisoner's getting out early. They are following exactly the sentence that the sentencing judge considered appropriate. Why would they do programs? Well, the restrictions that they're going to be under while they're on parole will depend very much on their participation in programs and their behaviour, both while in prison and on parole. So if they work hard in the programs and they show a willingness to rejoin the community as a non-offender, their parole conditions are likely to be much less restrictive. But they still get access to programs, post-release support, and all of the other stuff that facilitates re-entry into society. I totally understand why many people are antagonistic towards parole. After all, prisoners are there because they've committed offences against their particular victim and against our society as a whole. It's right that they suffer consequences. But if what we want at the end of the day is to reduce the number of future offences, parole is one of the best tools we have. Whether I've convinced you or not, I hope that did give you a new understanding of parole. Please keep the questions coming by email to me or to the good folks at the CDU Law Student Society. This program's all about you and the things you want to know. See you soon.